Vamos. ¿Cómo?
Can you see my screen?
Vamos a comenzar. Ahora, Andrea te va a presentar un minutín. Yo abro la sesión, Ethel.
Pero,
¿Okay?
momentito. Can you still see my screen?
We don't see your screen right now. The share screen, we don't see it. We see ourselves.
Well, I don't know why. This is why I okay, let me try again, okay? Can you see it now? Yes?
Yes, we can see. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Bravo.
Okay, fine.
Espera. Porque Isaac me está diciendo que no.
Okay.
Ok. Espera, que hay gente esperando para entrar.
Okay. We have people. It's great to see such an audience, but we have also a virtual audience that had to be admitted because this is an hybrid conference.
Of course.
Okay. So, should we? Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the closing session of the 6th WISC Global International Studies Conference. I'm Arie Kacowicz, a program chair, and Andrea Oelsner, program chair, and we are going to run this session. And the way we are going to proceed, we are very honored to have with us on Zoom, I guess from University of California, Irvine, our friend and colleague, Professor Ethel Solingen. Andrea will present her, and Ethel, I don't know how many of you know, but she's from Entre Rios, right? If I'm Chaco.
Yes.
So Andrea will tell you more about that. So we are going to learn together. We have a special session, a special class with Professor Ethel Solingen that she's going to talk about global production networks and international security. And this will be followed by a Q&A session, both here and virtual. And then we are going to formally close this conference with some remarks from Professor Marcelo. No, not now, after, and from myself. And enjoy. This is intellectual fun after 3 days. So without further ado, my dear colleague, friend, we work together so much, Andrea will run this part. Andrea.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you so especially to Ethel Solingen, who so kindly agreed to give the keynote speech, the closing keynote speech, which is a really important moment for us because it marks the end of successful, very intensive, and I hope, and I think that also very productive 3 days of exchange of knowledge, of ideas, of discussion. So we are very, very pleased actually to welcome and to present Professor Ethel Solingen. Professor Ethel Solingen is the 2022 Richard Holbrooke Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, Distinguished Professor and Thomas T. and Elizabeth C. Tierney Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She received the National Academy of Sciences William Catherine State Award, the Distinguished Scholar Award in International Security from the International Studies Association, and the Susan Strange Professorship at the London School of Economics. Her book, Nuclear Logics, Contrasting Paths in East Asia and the Middle East by Princeton University Press, won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award for the Best Book in Political Science and the ISA's Jervin and Schroeder's Award for the Best Book in International History and Politics. Other books include Regional Orders at the Century's Dawn, also Princeton University Press, Industrial Policy, Technology, and International Bargaining, Stanford University Press, Contemporary Regionalism, Routledge, Geopolitics, Supply Chains, and International Relations in East Asia, Cambridge University Press, Sanctions, Statecraft, and Nuclear Proliferation, Cambridge University Press, The Politics of International Diffusion, a symposium co-edited International Studies Review, and Scientists and the State, University of Michigan Press. She's the recipient of MacArthur Foundation Research and Writing Award on Peace and International Cooperation, a Social Science Research Council MacArthur Foundation Fellowship on Peace and Security in the Changing World, a Japan Foundation, SSRC, Abe Fellowship, an APSA Excellence in Mentorship Award, and an Academic Senate Distinguished Teaching Award, among others. Ethel Solingen was president of the International Studies Association, chair of the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation Steering Committee, chair of ISA's International Political Economy section, and chair of APSA's International History and Politics section. More than impressive. We are so pleased to have her to give us the keynote speech. So start as you listen to what all that she has to tell us and to say and to teach us, start taking notes and start drafting your questions so that we'll have a good Q&A session after after she finishes with her speech. Thank you very much. Ethel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Muy agradecida por la invitación de los colegas Pinar Bilgin, Andrea Oelsner y Arie Kacowicz, que trabajaron muy duro y parejo para que esta conferencia se lleve a cabo. I would like to thank the WISC team and the local organizers for this great privilege and for such generous introduction from Andrea. I do know what it takes to put together a program like this one. As Andrea mentioned, as ISA president a decade ago, we had about 1,200 panels at the convention, and it could not have happened without so many people working very hard to make it happen. I wish I was there with you to enjoy the fruits of so much work in Buenos Aires. But I do cherish even this second best opportunity to interact virtually with so many scholars from the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa at what is the first WISC hosted in Latin America. I'm fully aware of the richness of the program you all contributed to, and it's a testament to the growing richness of the discipline. I should say that I'm also very grateful to the Thomas and Elizabeth Tierney Chair at the University of California, Irvine, and to the University of California's Office of the President, and to the American Academy in Berlin, where I conducted research as the Richard Holbrooke Fellow. Ambassador Holbrooke, by the way, was the chief architect of the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia, and was responsible for US-China affairs during the normalization of their diplomatic relations back then in a different era. I mention this because it does tie in to some of the themes that I'll discuss today. We are now living in very difficult times for the people of Ukraine, first and foremost. We can only wish that peace is restored, even if human casualties cannot be. Russia's assault on the Ukraine had significant implications for my topic today. I've been working on the relationship between international political economy on the one hand and international security on the other for my entire professional life, applying it to understand contrasting regional orders, regionalism, economic statecraft, transnational diffusion, and nuclear proliferation, and some of the things that Andrea mentioned in her very kind introduction. I hope you're all able to see the screen. Are you able to see the screen right now?
Not yet.
Well, this is a problem. I've been trying to signal that it does cut me off the screen for some reason. I'm sharing it now.
Yes, it's
Yes.
working now. Yes.
We can
Very
see it.
Excellent, excellent. I hope it stays there. So what I'd like to do now is tell you a little bit about how I came up on this topic and what I learned in the course of doing that research. What deepened my interest in global supply chains, or what I'm going to call global value chains, GVCs, because that's the term used in the literature. So what deepened my interest in GVCs was an article I was working on in 2013 that eventually was published in International Security. It's listed there, Domestic Coalitions, Internationalization and War, Then and Now. The then was, of course, 1914. And then included also in this MIT volume with that by Professors Rosecrans and Miller with that very provocative title. It was really provocative in 2014, but much to our chagrin, today it's even less removed from reality than I thought at the time. In 2013, discussions about parallels between 1914 and 2014 proliferated, obviously because of the centenary of the outbreak of World War I. So the first wave of globalization had ended with World War I. And the question was, would the second wave of globalization incepted after World War II meet the same fate 100 years after the Great War, the so-called Great War, World War I? My view was that in 2013, you could identify significant differences between the two periods. And one difference was the very existence of complex GVCs, global value chains, in the global economy. Could GVCs prove more resilient to geopolitical tensions than other forms of economic exchange were prior to World War I? Interest in GVCs in the context of superpower competition and geopolitics was close to nil at the time. So I became intrigued by the hypothesis that GVC interdependence just might engender novel mechanisms that raise the cost of foregoing interdependence quite significantly. That they might foster stronger incentives to sustain peace than would be the case in their absence. Those effects, I thought then, might hypothetically be especially relevant to complex GVCs, which means those with a high proportion of so-called intangibles. That's R&D, research and development, services, etc. Those intangibles that bind states in ways that transcend classical forms of trade and financial interdependence circa 1914, that they would have different effects because they were different forms of interdependence. Because after all, 4 decades of striking GVC expansion in East Asia in particular, under outward-oriented political economy strategies, coincided with incredible restraint in handling disputes. I thought, again, back in 2013, that it was worth exploring the extent to which GVCs could have contributed to that outcome. And reciprocally, geopolitical stability, predictability, and cooperation clearly enabled GVC expansion. Indeed, it would be hard to imagine GVC expansion since the 1980s, especially in East Asia, against the scenario of violent wars that characterized East Asia in earlier times, up until then, or against the scenario of other world regions where the GVC infrastructure remains much thinner or non-existent, as is the case, for instance, in the Middle East. I actually had worked on those cross-regional comparisons before. This one is from 2007. And here, East Asian states have the highest levels of GVC participation in the industrializing world and have achieved highest levels of growth, employment, income, technological development, export diversification, literacy levels of 96%, and global access. Foreign technology, via the unbundling of capital, technology, and management in GVCs, in this global value chains, enabled remarkable growth in research and development, human capital, and very high levels of intra-regional economic interdependence. Whereas by contrast, the Middle East has among the lowest rates of GVC participation and intra-regional economic interdependence, as well as you know, a high level of interstate conflict, intra and interstate conflict. But back to 2013, I'm now plunging into this GVC literature and asking, very complex literature, many dimensions to it. I'm asking experts now, 2013, how to gauge GVC resilience. Not because I knew anything about it, but exactly the opposite. But I thought then, if GVCs were the underbelly of the so-called long peace, especially in East Asia, how would we know whether the underbelly was, well, flabby or in good shape? And mind you, even invoking the word resilience in the context of GVCs back then was below the radar, even after the global financial crisis. And you can see this in this plot, this quick Google Trends count. So I was about where the arrow is in 2013. And as you can see, the incidence of the word resilience was very low, was very flat from 2007 onwards. But though under the radar, it seemed to me that for understanding the issue at hand, gauging GVC resilience was the coin of the realm. The next stage in this exploration was a collaborative project that yielded 2 publications in 2021, an edited collection by Cambridge University Press and a contribution to the latest GVC development report published by a consortium of international economic institutions, as you can see there, the Asian Development Bank, WTO, etc., and by research institutions in China and Japan, or a contribution on rising risks from and to GVCs. But before proceeding any further, let me say a few words about what GVCs are. So experts in economics and management use GVCs to describe these networks that spread the full range of tasks related to R&D, production, and marketing of products and services over several countries, from design to end use and beyond. So each stage or each task contributes some value added to the final product, leading to so-called made-in-the-world goods that can have hundreds of inputs from dozens of different countries, as you can see in these examples right here. these intermediate goods crisscross borders, often several times over, to be assembled into a final product. Samsung, for instance, relies on about 2,500 suppliers across the globe to produce mobile phones. I don't have mobile phones in these three examples, but GVCs thus capture, following Spence 219, a complex network structure of flows of goods, services, capital, and technology across national borders. This goes to show this intuition I had that the level of GVC interdependence is really at a different level from financial interdependence only, or gross trade interdependence that was typical of the pre-World War I era. Now, the big growth spurt of GVCs took place between 1988 basically since the 1990s to 2008, a period that some people label hyperglobalization, when GVCs accounted for up to about 2/3 of total gross trade. So up to 2/3 of total trade, gross trade, was in the form of GVCs or intermediate goods, inputs, etc. GVC participation rates roughly estimate how much an economy is connected to GVCs for production and foreign trade. GVC participation for the world as a whole plummeted during the financial crisis, as you can see in this slide, but recovered. Look at 2018. They peaked in 2018, declining with the trade war since. The trade war really became more prominent under the Trump administration since 2018 and the application of sanctions. Interestingly, especially bear in mind this plot here of the changes in global value chain participation rates and the enormous growth in GVC participation. Bear in mind, when you look at this graph, over the same period of time, this chart, available from Our World in Data, a fantastic source for anybody doing research today, shows the decline in absolute number of battle deaths per year by world region. And you see there are three peaks: the Korean War in the early 1950s, the Vietnam War around 1970, and the Iran War and Afghanistan wars in the 1980s. But notice in red, the prominence of deaths in conflict in Asia until the early 1980s, and the sharp decline since 1990, the very period of dramatic expansion of GVCs in East Asia. Notice also the orange increase in deaths since the Arab Spring for the Middle East, which, as I said, ranks very low in GVC participation rates. Now, in the last few years, GVCs have endured several shocks. First came the US-China trade and technology war, an ongoing thing. China began departing from earlier goals of maximizing economic growth and from deploying the famous charm offensive, and began incepting so-called self-sufficiency schemes around 2014. And this came in the form, for instance, of the Made in China 2025 program and other industrial policy plans to enhance self-reliance across a wide range of sectors. In 2018, the Trump administration unleashed those tariffs and called for reshoring GVCs to counter China's forced technology transfers, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, failure to enforce intellectual property, and other transgressions well known from a WTO perspective that have been discussed in WTO and other settings. Now, the tariffs, of course, achieved little of those objectives of the Trump administration. Now, geoeconomic shocks, including trade and technology wars, as the one unleashed in 2018, target products, sectors, and industries that are highly vulnerable due to high input specificity. GVC hubs with high potential for diffusing throughout the economy. Knowledge-intensive GVCs in specialized and localized ecosystems that have unique suppliers and expert pools that are difficult to substitute, or with limited geographic mobility. And they also target dual-use sectors, obviously with civilian and military applications and frontier technologies. You hear this day in and day out nowadays. Some of these categories, of course, overlap. The mechanisms through which geopolitical shocks, and this is all in that report that I mentioned at the outset, in case anybody's interested in sort of deepening their interest in those topics. What are the mechanisms through which geopolitical shocks affect GVCs? Well, they include some of those I listed here. They magnify generalized uncertainty. They reduce trust in the integrity of GVCs. They dilute the expected benefits from GVC participation, and they induce or they trigger vertical contagion, which means basically escalatory retaliation, as you know, US-China processes here, or Japan, South Korea, etc. They exacerbate horizontal contagion onto third parties. Third parties become involved, and they decrease movement of people and expertise. Now, it was hard enough, it had been hard enough to get reliable metrics of the extent of the so-called GVC reshoring and decoupling since 2018, with the onset of these geoeconomic and geopolitical tensions, when a second shock number 2, COVID-19, unleashed yet another crisis, fast and furious, with implications for GVCs. Well, you may remember this, but no less importantly, supplies of medical equipment and other basic items became scarce, at least partially because some governments, including China, curtailed some exports, although those GVCs were eventually restored. All the while, a third underlying shock, climate change, was delivering even more extreme weather and a higher incidence of extreme events. So now I was looking at a trifecta: environmental, pandemic, and geopolitical meta-shocks to GVCs. And these concatenated crises were happening literally while I was preparing those publications. They were moving targets, very hard to gauge, especially for me, because in my previous work, I typically looked at more longer durée kind of phenomena. Nonetheless, some of the conclusions, very preliminary at the time, of those studies as of late 2021, and I want to emphasize that, some of the conclusions were that first, these meta risks, environmental, pandemic, and geopolitical, had become interconnected and endogenous to each other. For example, the debate on the origins of COVID-19 exacerbated pre-existing geopolitical tensions between the US and China. For another, GVC's increase in energy consumption and CO2 emissions, and offshoring to countries that are less subject to environmental and labor regulations, overusing resources and increasing waste. You can immediately see the connections between between these three meta shocks. There is also a rising number of green firms in GVCs, but climate change continues to increase the odds of no pandemics. Those two are related too, climate change and pandemics. So there are spillovers from one risk to another. Obviously, the rise of protectionism and extreme versions of inward-looking hyper-nationalism and populism affect GVCs directly and fuel those geopolitical tensions. So clearly, these meta risks create a vicious cycle. They reinforce each other, they create unfortunate synergies among them, and they compound their effects. Indeed, I argue that they generate additional risks, for instance, cyber attacks, cyber theft, and others that become part of this vicious cycle. All these effects piled up, leading to those calls for reshoring and decoupling. Analytically, the geopolitical tensions that threaten GVCs may just be more foundational because they undermine the ability of states to cooperate in tackling climate change, preventing future pandemics, and much more. Now, GVCs can be blamed for many things, but not for everything. So in that light, a second broad conclusion that the study tried to project was that GVCs can amplify the impact of shocks upstream and downstream, which of course is part of the problem, but they can also help mitigate those risks, which can be part of the solution as well. An OECD study published in 2020 found that so-called localized regimes, by which they mean inward-looking political economies, are more vulnerable to shocks, more, not less, more, because they cannot substitute scarcities with foreign inputs. And that by contrast, the study notes, interconnected regimes, by which they mean outward-oriented strategies like Germany, for instance, that are embedded in dense GVCs are also better to adjust to shocks. And many other studies confirm those intuitions and findings. In the words of WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, re-globalization, or what she calls deeper, more diversified international markets, she says, remain our best bet for supply resilience, end of quote. Another finding was that compounded shocks had led to China's partial decline as factory of the world, but hardly China's demise. However, we also warned back then in 2021 that uncertainty about geopolitics and technological competition could unleash more sizable disruptions in the global geography of production. And the study concluded that compounded geopolitical, environmental, pandemic, and cyber risks basically have generated incentives to invest significantly in enhancing resilience of GVCs, and that those investments could yield a stronger, reinvigorated, nimble, and geographically diversified GVC infrastructure that could perhaps be better able to cope with those meta risks, hopefully declining meta risks. Alternatively, compounded risks driven by this more inward-oriented strategies, we argued back in 2021, could lead to further GVC decoupling and a more significant decline of China as factory of the world. And I added, finally, that this study goes to press at an inflection point, 2021, precluding a definitive assessment of how impregnable or how resilient GVCs are to those meta risks. Little did I know, but before I get to that, let me actually share with you something about how did these GVCs respond to these shocks and uncertainty? Because remember, GVCs are not government entities for the most part. Yes, the government of China sponsors many of those state-owned enterprises as GVCs, but for the most part, the leading firms in the world in GVC structures are private firms. So how do they respond to all of these shocks and uncertainty? Out of over 700 firms deployed globally, 96% of US-based firms and 100% of European ones listed China among their top 3 sourcing countries in 2019. But that declined to 77% and 80% respectively by March 2021. In 2021, 92% of US and other foreign firms and 85% of Chinese firms deemed an escalation in US-China trade tensions to be quite likely or very likely. This is from some surveys by Chambers of Commerce. In 2020 and 2021, US-China tensions topped the list of challenges for the first time, surpassing, as you see in the slide, surpassing regulatory issues, rising labor costs, and other issues of importance to them. And this is reflected in this business climate survey. You can see rising tensions at the top in 21 and 2022. Mind you, 2021 and 2022 refers to the previous year. The surveys are published the year following the survey. However, these and other surveys did not detect massive or immediate GVC relocation out of China, perhaps because of China's comparative advantage and domestic market size. And also because these lock-in effects raise the cost of relocation away from upstream and downstream partners or suppliers, especially in the short term. It takes time to build that network. So reshoring, what is known as reshoring, bringing GVCs back, was hardly the standard GVC response at that point. There were very few signs of a GVC bifurcation into a US or China spheres of influence. By late 2021, it was still hard to detect a fundamental restructuring of the GVC landscape, except for growing diversification to lower cost destinations, for instance, to Southeast Asia and Mexico. Mexico prominent in that. In those changes. And this was labeled the China plus one or China plus many strategies, where basically China's domestic market remained a powerful source of attraction, but the strategy added other countries to soften extreme dependence on China. So at the time, it seemed that a revised, but far from obsolescing GVC infrastructure had some chance to emerge, and possibly a more resilient one, because GVCs were investing in resilience. 87% by one estimate were investing in resilience. How? By what means? Well, they were so-called de-risking supply chains via, first of all, diversification, right? Not leaning completely on China the way it had been for 3 decades, but also via automation, digitalization, something called just-in-case production to replace just-in-time production or more quote-unquote efficient forms of organization, via building capacity buffers, via regionalization of supply chains or shortening supply chains, or something called nearshoring, right? For instance, Mexico and the US market, and shorter GVCs in general. So WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala even argued that this process of adjusting and building resilience could end up integrating poorer countries in Africa and other parts of the world more deeply into GVCs. Very briefly, I want to share with you some policy recommendations in that study, because they're still very relevant. First was, we recommended at the time, immediate global vaccination against COVID and immediate agreement on early warning systems of pandemic prevention. Increasing sensitivity to the domestic distributional considerations from participating in GVCs, because multinational corporations had captured massive returns from progressively more knowledge-intensive GVCs, these intangibles, deepening income disparities and eroding public support for GVCs, especially in the US, as you can see, given the political trends, the Trump administration policies I'm referring to. Stronger antitrust policies, we recommended fair tax reforms, more equitable labor protections, and improved data collection on intangibles that could provide stronger foundations for an inclusive labor force. A minimum global corporate tax was a step forward, and actually it's much needed, and we may be on the way to that hopefully soon, not without problems. But trade and social inclusion was the message there. Trade and social inclusion and cohesion must go together. Another thing we prioritized or we underlined was prioritizing renewable energy and immediate decarbonization, battling illegal deforestation, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, adopting minimum carbon pricing, reusable packaging, and zero waste. Reducing geopolitical tensions that had engendered unprecedented risks to GVCs, undermining contributions to growth, welfare, innovation, productivity, and peaceful exchange. And, of course, strengthen multilateral institutions to rebuild trust, compliance, non-discrimination, reciprocity, transparency, fair competition, safer cross-border digital flows, and preventing nefarious use of cyberspace. For all of those, we do need international institutions to perform those tasks of bridging the gaps. And finally, I spoke about diversification, reducing dependence on single countries for production or sourcing. So immediate cooperation on climate change, for instance, is imperative because it might not only help soften the rough edges of geopolitical and pandemic risks, but also reinforce mutual commitments to all three agendas. And outward-oriented strategies were better poised, we wrote in the report, to advance those objectives. Now, these exogenous shocks that I just discussed, the environmental, pandemic, and geopolitical, thus far might have overdetermined the end of GVCs as we knew them. These are big shocks. They might have completely demolished that GVC infrastructure I discussed so far. But as of early 2022, they did not seem to have had that effect because of building resilience and all the items I just discussed. But then came Putin's assault on the Ukraine, completing the perfect or the wicked storm for GVCs. So as fate would have it, I arrived at the American Academy in Berlin as the war started. And that was a most interesting vantage point because Berlin was not only very affected by the war in many ways, very close to the war zone, but Germany is also one of the 3 major GVC hubs in the world. And a lot of discussion over responses to Russia's onslaught had to do with coordinating GVCs across the transatlantic alliance. Furthermore, one of my responsibilities at the Academy was to organize the Holbrooke workshop on GVC developments, especially in the shadows of Putin's war. So here are some very preliminary reflections on what seems to be happening in this sort of compressed and oppressive period of world politics, mostly for the people of the Ukraine, but with many secondary and tertiary effects on the rest of the world that I will discuss in a second. What has changed since? A much more significant revision of the GVC landscape, the one I described a couple of minutes ago as of late 2021 or early 2022. A more significant revision of that landscape seems plausible today. Now, you're all familiar with the exodus of firms out of Russia, but Russia was never a key player in GVCs, okay? Very, very little. Russia has been an inward-looking, except for exporting these raw materials, an inward-looking political economy under Putin. So it was never a key player in GVCs by any stretch, but the war had implications and second and third order effects well beyond that. So a survey of global economic uncertainty by Arie et al. Reports that global uncertainty rose to levels similar to September 11, 2001 in the aftermath of Russia's attack, and that uncertainty related to the war accounted for almost 40% of the global total. There is also a growing perception of rising risks of investing in non-democratic and war-prone contexts. A recent survey, for instance, by the IFO Institute in Germany found that 46% of German companies receive significant inputs from China. And of those, almost half were planning to reduce their dependence on China. Another survey released in May by the European Union Chamber of Commerce reported that Beijing's strict zero COVID controls and Russia's war in the Ukraine have undermined China's attraction for more than 3/4 of European firms responding to that survey. 94%, 97%, and 94% were acutely affected by logistics, warehousing, business travel, and the inability to conduct face-to-face meetings. So all of these things featured very high in concerns among German companies. You must have, may have seen this a couple of months ago, with hundreds of ships and millions of containers stalled across the coast of China. 92%, and I mean millions per day, 92% of firms polled reported that port closures in China reduced transportation and rising freight costs have impacted their supply chains. And 23% was more than double the number of firms that were considering doing that in early 2022. I'm still talking about European GVCs. This is the highest proportion in a decade, and growing number of European firms are considering reducing investment in China further. For instance, according to another survey, the war in Ukraine has made China less attractive for at least 33% of respondents. And the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce, Jörg Wuttke, expressed that, and I quote, "Our members are willing to weather the current storm, but if the current situation continues, they will, of course, increasingly evaluate alternatives to China." And he added, a more expensive functioning market is better than one that is relatively cheaper but paralyzed, end of quote. At that time, Chancellor Olaf Scholz labeled Russia's attack really in a kind of incredible historical turn in European politics. He labeled Russia's attack on the Ukraine a watershed moment. In Germany, it goes by the term Zeitenwende. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, she's from the Greens party, was especially vocal in countering China's threats and economic coercion, for instance, vis-a-vis Lithuania. And she expressed that the war in Ukraine showed that the security of Europe depended on NATO's collective defense. This, for all of you that are perhaps less familiar with domestic German politics, this was quite a Zeitenwende, a turn for a Green Party. The policies of the Green Party classically were very different from the ones that are resurfing at the moment. US firms are also revising the risk associated with suppliers and regions where access to the internet is state controlled or where suppliers are state captive, like those state enterprises, or where the risk of launching military action is higher. Because in their view, power is concentrated in the hands of unchecked rulers. Industry experts observe that reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring, all those terms you probably hear, are gaining pressing consideration. And there is a rising pressure also from stakeholders, from employees, their families, and consumers to minimize geographical exposure to geopolitical risk and to environmental, labor, and human rights practices in GVCs. Industry surveys also show rising awareness of risks stemming from autocratic and unstable context for GVC sourcing. Putin's threats regarding potential use of nuclear weapons, for instance, have led to industry advisories to firms that discuss things like ICBMs, MAD, tactical nuclear devices. In all my years tracking these surveys, I never encounter anything remotely connected to that kind of geostrategic language. As a side note, Andrea discussed some of my work. Having conducted research on nuclear weapons for decades, I tried to leave all that behind about a decade ago, as I was saying initially. To leave that behind and learn more about GVCs, well, there's no escape, and nuclear weapons seem to remain the ultimate risk. Berlin was definitely reflecting that concern very vividly. But let me now turn to a broader theme that emerges from this tour of the world of GVCs at a higher level of abstraction. I think I have about 7-8 minutes. Wherever we are today,
Actually, Ethel, you have 2 minutes according to the clock.
Oh, okay. So wherever we are today, I say we must think countercyclically. As we argued in an essay with Peter Gurevich, the founding dean of the School of International Relations at the University of California, listed on top of this slide, the essay surveyed a couple of centuries of world politics, the longue durée, or cycles of inward-looking and outward-looking political economy strategies. Gurevich was the author of a seminal study entitled Politics in Hard Times on political coalitions and competing responses to globalization since the end of the 19th century, including in the interwar period in Europe and the US. And I had also relied extensively on the nature of political economy coalitions for comparing regional orders beyond Europe, especially in those 3 books listed in there. The point of that work was that there was no unilinear secular trajectory in either direction, or an irreversible course towards or away from globalization that prevailed till the end of history. This has never been a perfectly recursive pattern, of course, because the social, economic, and political world are always evolving. And the argument was that coalitional analysis was often missing in standard theories linking interdependence with peace or war, because most studies concentrate on economistic measures, for instance, trade openness, imports plus exports over GDP, but those studies ignore political agency. So our plea was to move beyond economistic measures and look at the role of these coalitions and really these coalitions permeate this analysis over the long durée of engagement with and retreat from the global economy. I have a lot more to say about these coalitions as the connective tissue between Innenpolitik and Außenpolitik, and their role as a mechanism in explaining how economic exchange with the world may or may not have inhibited war in the 20th or the 21st centuries. I have a lot more to say, including about the Biden administration, barriers and so on. And I would have wanted to share with you this particular short video by WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, but I'm told my time has ended. So let me just say that, and I'd be happy to do that later if we have a few more minutes, but the current conjuncture gives us material to study the possible association between economic interdependence via GVCs and international peace and cooperation. Rising protectionism and the unraveling of GVCs has gone hand in hand with the unraveling of the post-Cold War cooperative security structure. Why are both unraveling synchronously? Indeed, are they unraveling inexorably? Perhaps the fact that GVCs still stand, even after all those unrelenting shocks that I discussed here today, is indeed a story of resilience that just may part ways with 1914. But stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel. Thank you very much. We've, no, not us. We need her, Ethel's image on the screen, please. Necesitamos la imagen de Ethel en la pantalla, no la nuestra.
Ya está.
Ah, genial.
Okay.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. So the floor is now open to questions. There's a microphone that we can move around.
Is the screen done? Is the sharing screen done?
Yes, that's done, yes.
Okay.
Questions? Maybe I'll jump and I ask you a question, Ethel. We're here in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Latin America, South America, and you gave us a very comprehensive, fascinating talk, globalization, interdependence, focusing on global supply chains and peace and war. I can ask you the same question we were asked this afternoon at the Legislatura de Buenos Aires, how globalization or deglobalization or the phenomena that you are studying in the last few years might have an effect upon Argentina in particular and Latin America in general. Thank you.
As fate would have it, about a week ago, so there's this study that I tried to share with you today on published by this consortium of international institutions. And about a week ago, the study was discussed at a meeting hosted by the WTO in conjunction with Economic Commission for UN Economic Commission for Latin America and participants from ALADI and other institutions in Latin America. And one of the topics of consideration was precisely something I mentioned in passing today, was this issue of regionalization or nearshoring, nearshoring basically means bringing supply chains, for instance, to Mexico. Mexico has been a great beneficiary of some of the changes going on, right? Rather than producing in China, producing in Mexico, you have access to the NAFTA market, whatever the new name is. So this nearshoring, right, has legs, and some people are contemplating expand. Remember, diversification is almost a universally agreed concept that to make GVCs more robust, you need to diversify. You can't have everything in China or any other country for that matter. If they're concentrated in Taiwan, it's also not good, right? That's for semiconductors. So diversification is the name of the game. And to do that, one path to that is to integrate the Americas much better into GVCs than they have been, because Latin America has, unfortunately, from at least the perspective of this kind of tight analysis of the effects of GVCs, Latin America has been quite removed from GVCs with some exceptions, Mexico, for instance, being one of them. So the idea was that perhaps this is a convenient conjuncture to plug greater interaction across the Americas in GVCs on the one hand, as well as create greater synergies among Latin American countries that goes by regionalization, right? Via GVCs. So GVCs, for instance, in Africa, there is actually a lot of action in terms of creating GVCs that connect countries within, for instance, this Southern Africa area or others, and the rest of the world. So the most important thing here was, I guess, the understanding that a return to pure region-based institutions wasn't necessarily the way to go, because these GVCs in East Asia, which really are at the heart of the global economy today, they did not emerge from this so-called regionalism that I've studied for most of my life as well. And East Asia is also a very good example of how East Asia's integration in global GVCs had the effect of actually regionalizing GVCs within East Asia as well. So both have gone up, both the extent of East Asia's engagement with the rest of the world and East Asia's engagement with each other. So that was sort of the distillation of what could be a path for other regions that had not been integrated in GVCs in a significant way until now.
Thank you, Ethel.
Yes, we have another question from the floor that came through a note, and they ask, are inward-looking more vulnerable to external shocks because of being less integrated to GVCs, or because they are mainly third world, less developed countries with more fragile domestic economies unable to adapt due to structural problems?
That's a very good question. And I think one of the problems is that we are aggregating across such different entities, right? And countries around the world that it's really very hard to, to apportion the vulnerability of the fragility. Look, South Korea was once a very fragile. South Korea's GDP in the 1960s was equal to North Korea's in the 1960s. Its so-called trade openness was 13%. 13%. Now, South Korea evolved into the 10th largest economy today. I don't know if you have colleagues from South Korea in the audience, but how did they get there? So they got there not through inward looking, not through emphasizing inward looking political economies or strategies because of potential vulnerabilities, which they were. They were a country in a shambles after the Korean War in the 1950s. It was a country in a shambles with, as I say, the same racial trade openness as North Korea, which was already an inward-looking country. So yes, there are vulnerabilities. I picked South Korea because it is an example of a country that was pretty fragile. You can actually make a comparison with the Ukraine today. After a war and a lot of rebuilding, it has no natural resources. It had one thing, and that was developed over time, and that was human capital. But it did so, all of that, through engagement in the global economy. Now, can every country replicate? I don't know. The different countries have not just different endowments, of course, different policies. And under some conditions, of course, countries that don't have domestic markets that can cushion all of these shocks are more at risk. So let me actually bring it back to South Korea, because during COVID, South Korea was subject to these tensions as well. They immediately converted their experience via GVCs to produce medical equipment and other items that they really were pioneers in turning around and distributing to the rest of the world those items. They were agile. So you may think some of these countries may be more fragile. They can also be more agile. It all depends on the politics of the country and how they steer themselves through these shocks. Look, many of the big countries became and continue to be very vulnerable to shocks. So they have different sensitivities and vulnerabilities. But the question I think I mentioned in the presentation, that if you're only building on your, and this is one of the concerns of what is happening in the United States, actually, is that, and the United States has some capability to build across the board industries in a way that makes it perhaps less dependent. But even then, even for big countries, even for a big country like China, self-sufficiency turns out to be not a guarantee of absence of vulnerability, nor is inward-looking self-reliance a guarantee for resilience.
Thank you, Ethel. We have another question from the floor. This is from Professor Marcin Grabowski from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. Marcin, if somebody can... you have the mic.
I have it already. Thank you, Arie. And thank you, Ethel, for your magnificent talk, inspiring regarding this complexity of the topic, not only complexity of those GVCs. But I wonder whether we can follow the hypothesis deeply rooted in this complex interdependence approach that as we observed at the chart after 2018, this GVC started to disappear. COVID has accelerated the process. Therefore, nearshoring on the one hand, yeah, that's good because we have a nearshoring. We can reduce the risks. We can increase resilience to asymmetric shocks, as I could say in this case. But at the same time, we are facing much higher risk because conflicts, the serious conflicts, are simply at higher risk if we reduce GVC's complexity globally. So shall we do it according to what you would advise and reduce GVC's complexities globally, or we should avoid this nearshoring because in this case we can support stable global system? That would be the brief question here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very good question. I'm not completely sure I get the complete thrust of it, but let me try, because there were different things going on here. The nearshoring and the reducing GVC complexity, and those are not necessarily the same thing. But I'm actually also going to throw back a question to you, because Poland and indeed the Ukraine were some of those countries that benefited extensively from insertion in GVCs, especially related to Germany. So GVCs have three main nodes. North America is one, China is the other, of course, and Germany is the other. And their regional their neighboring countries are very much connected to those nodes, but they're also connected to the rest of the world. Okay, so don't imagine this as a sort of a regionalized, not connected structure. It's very connected internationally, but it's also connected regionally. So I'm actually intrigued by if you can share with us some of the experience of, let's say, both Poland, maybe the Ukraine, in terms, the Ukraine, for instance, played apparently a significant role in some of the inputs for the German car industry and so on and so forth. But so nearshoring is exactly what the GVCs centered on Germany are possibly thinking about, right? Well, the Ukraine is no longer, at this moment, no longer an area where you can transfer, where you can nearshore, right? But Portugal is back, and some of these other adjacent countries could arguably, even Hungary or Bulgaria, or some of these countries apparently are potential providers of inputs that were once provided by longer GVCs meaning ones that are offshore to Asia, for instance. Asia is far from Europe. So nearshoring is not the complete solution. As I've said, there are some reservations of thinking about the future of GVCs simply as a kind of regional structure. Well, we'll do the region and that's it. It won't work the same way, and it won't be what it was. And that we know from the East Asian experience, right? That as they increased their connections to the rest of the world, they also increased their connections to each other. Reducing GVC complexity, I'm not sure what you're alluding to, because the complexity of GVCs depends on the industry, right? The sector we're talking about. But even within a sector, food GVCs, they can be relatively simple. You know, the exportation of, for instance, Russia and the Ukraine used to export grains and so on, but not a lot of processing. Or GVCs can be very complex in the area of food if they need a lot of processing, packaging, and they cross border several times until the final product is exported to many countries. But so thank you for the question. And let me throw out again, maybe you can share with us in brief, how do you see the evolution of GVCs in that part of the world before and especially now after the Ukraine debacle?
Okay, so I'll try, of course, but that's basically, if I can step in, if the moderators let me do it. Poland is probably one of the most highly dependent on Germany, as you know, with almost 30% of its exports going to Germany. And to a large extent, that is also the case of neighboring countries, Czechia, Slovakia, and to some extent Hungary. Ukraine was much less dependent, and there were a set of reasons for not locating still either services or industries in the Ukraine, having in mind this modern approaches to develop, like reliability of the legal system, high level of corruption that reduced the likelihood it could be easily and resiliently, if I can say so, be adapted. Of course, the war has changed much, and Ukraine being a source of relatively simple products, yeah, so it's not the case any longer. You've mentioned the issue of grains. Whether the COVID and this nearshoring will be visible in Central Europe, I wouldn't expect massive reindustrialization here, because still there is not much idle labor force, yeah, unless we will be fast in adapting people that migrated. I'm not sure whether temporarily or for longer from the Ukraine. Yeah, then we'll have surplus of labor, and we could add more to our productivity, let's say. So I see Arie smiling, and that probably means that we should move to next questions. But yeah, let me just say one last sentence. The one last sentence is whether I properly understand the hypothesis of your presentation that because we will have less GVCs, we have higher likelihood of war. This is the essence of the question that was maybe much longer before. Thanks, and sorry for talking a bit too long.
No, don't be sorry, because I take the Q&As as an opportunity for me to also learn from the audience, and you definitely contributed to that. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from the Zoom, from somebody, actually from one of our colleagues also in the organization, Anna Robel, sitting in Poland. I don't know, Anna, if you can open your microphone and perhaps also your camera and ask the question yourself.
You're muted, Anna. Yeah, you're muted.
Anna Robel.
If not, I can read the question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now I can speak. So hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor, for this excellent presentation. Actually, I wonder about the role of WTO in this process of making global value chains more resilient. Actually, in the debate which we had during the COVID crisis on the WTO, there was a lot about the implementation of facilitation of trade facilitation agreement, but in my opinion, it is insufficient. It's not. We need more work from the WTO side. So my question is, what other efforts can the WTO undertake to make GVCs more resilient? Thank you very much.
Well, Thank you, Anna, for that really crucial questions. And this is the point at which I wonder if I can still share directly from the WTO, the Director General. Can I share a video, 5 minutes?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, because I think she would certainly say it in a much more eloquent way. And so let me share again.
Good afternoon.
Let me share the screen again. Can you see the screen?
It's opening, yes. Can you, what is it, magnify it? Oh,
Yes, I will magnify it. So you can see it, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me just try to, I'll start it and then I will put it.
Everyone,
Let me see just a second.
Dr. Ngozi. What?
I'm going to do.
I think it's at the bottom.
No, first of all, you know what I need to do is slideshow, current slide.
That's right.
Oops. And then I have to move. No.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Ngozi.
No, this doesn't work. So let me do it from here. I'm wondering why. Okay, let me start and I'll try to figure out how to.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Ngozi. Welcome all to the Global Supply Chain Forum that we're.
If you put it by clicking on presentation mode.
Good afternoon, everyone.
No, because it's in a different.
Dr. Ngozi. Welcome all
Just
to the Global Supply Chain Forum that we're organizing today. We just have had with the DG some discussion with leaders of the sector. And I just like to introduce.
You know what? Just a sec. I'm trying to do it, but just 1 second.
Good afternoon. Top of our minds. Supply chain.
Let's just start with her,
Thank
okay?
you. Thanks, Jean-Marie, and welcome everyone to our first Global Supply Chain Forum. Thank you for joining us today. Even before the war in Ukraine, which is at the top of our minds, supply chain disruptions were weighing on global trade, economic growth, and price stability. We convened this meeting to explore what practical solutions the WTO, both members and the Secretariat, can bring to the table to help solve these issues, as we've done over the past year for trade in COVID-19 vaccines and inputs. I thank our stellar lineup of speakers for making the time to share ideas with us, and I thank my wonderful WTO colleagues for organizing the event today. We just finished a fantastic meeting with CEOs and other leaders from every part of the supply chain. Everyone is willing to cooperate to find solutions. And hopefully we will come back with the takeaways from all of this event today to see how the WTO can help to make things work better. Back in November, we held an information session to look at congested ports, shipping logjams, rising freight rates, and other supply chain challenges that had emerged in the wake of the supply and demand shocks arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. It became clear that many problems we were grappling with then and now are the result of more goods moving across borders than ever before. It's worth taking a moment to remember that the issues we are working to solve are problems born of success. Without effective government policies to sustain demand and keep markets broadly open, without nimble adaptation by businesses as consumers shifted from services to durable goods, and without the heroic efforts of seafarers, truck drivers, longshore and warehouse workers, pilots and others to keep goods moving, the pandemic could easily have led to a prolonged collapse in growth and trade. But that is of little comfort to everyone on the wrong end of supply chain disruptions and high shipping costs, which are proving more stubbornly persistent than many of us had expected. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises have been hit particularly hard, given their narrower margins and more limited financial resources. Poor countries, small and vulnerable economies, and landlocked developing countries risk being pushed out of global value chains or finding it even harder to break into them. Pandemic-related supply chain disruptions are weighing heavily on LDCs and LLDCs. The pandemic continues to threaten further supply shocks, and the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine is adding to supply chain woes. While its full implications for global supply networks will take time to become clear, we have seen immediate impacts on global food security, with sharp price increases for grains, oilseeds, and vegetable oils and fertilizer, as well as energy. We are monitoring developments closely with our partners. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to hear from an exciting range of voices: ocean carriers, port operators, logistics companies, government representatives, and businesses of all sizes. We will hear about how they have experienced the supply chain disruptions and how they have responded. And we will hear their ideas for how we can build more resilient and inclusive supply chains in the future. Much like the WTO itself, our supply chain infrastructure needs to remain fit for purpose. Because even though the supply chain network expanded in size and efficiency to enable a huge increase in global trade, the volume of merchandise exports was 3.7 times higher, almost 4 times higher in 2019 than in 1990. It was not built for a world where a climate disaster can interrupt factory operations worldwide, or a microscopic virus can upend the movement of goods, services, and people almost overnight. This is no case to a retreat from trade. I just want to emphasize that, because trade helps us adapt to these and other shocks. Deeper and more diversified international markets remain our best bet for supply resilience. It is clear that equipping our supply chain infrastructure to cope better with sudden changes demands action and investment, both public and private. But the question I want to put to you is, what more we can do? What more can we do to address supply chain choke points by fostering diversification? Bringing more countries into international production networks, what I would like to call re-globalization, would be a win for supply resilience and for development. The WTO offers a unique forum for global dialogue on supply chain issues. Through our monitoring function, we helped identify bottlenecks and reduce export restrictions affecting the production and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Enhancing trade facilitation can accelerate throughput at borders. Liberalizing trade in transport and logistics services is a third tool to bolster supply chain infrastructure. I always say that the global trading system of the 21st century needs to deliver for people everywhere. Making supply chains work better is part of that. That's why the ideas we're exchanging today are so important, and I can't wait to listen to them. Thank you.
Okay.
I think now we can proceed to the fireside chat.
Oh, wait.
From large and small businesses.
Yes, sorry. I find it very interesting what the Director General said, because it actually addresses some of the questions that were asked from me before, and I will come back to Anna in a minute. But notice she says the absence of GVCs makes poor countries more, not less vulnerable. Then she says this is no case for retreat from trade, and so on and so forth, so reinforcing only far more eloquently some of the points, the distillation of the points that I've learned from immersing myself in this topic. But to Anna's point, Anna is raising something very interesting about the WTO. Is it up to the job? So up until 10 days ago or so, you heard a lot of pessimism, even among people that understand that international institutions are crucial, okay? Even among those people, a lot of pessimism about what the WTO can and cannot do. The reason being, logically, because the WTO is not provided the kind of authorities by countries that it should have to execute some of the good ideas, for instance, in terms of vaccines and food supplies and so on. And that's the structure of world politics today that has rendered institutions such as the WTO far less able to do those things. And in the case of the United States, it was the Trump administration that undermined the WTO, removing some of the supports that it needed to actually execute its functions. But the same goes for other countries, powerful countries, China included, that have not acted on 30 years of WTO commitments to that were codified in its accession in 2001 to the WTO. So there are many reasons why the WTO has difficulties in executing some of the conversations that have been going on. But up until 10 days ago, that pessimism was record, right? And then came an interesting breakthrough. I wouldn't say it's a game changer. Perhaps it's a game changer. I don't know. I don't know. But it was a very successful set of achievements in 3 or 4 areas, including a major one, fisheries. A major one because some powerful countries that dominate the seas with state-owned enterprises and so on have been rendered now, the beginnings of a regime that will control the overuse of resources in the oceans that has been going on, especially over the last decade, which also has contributed, for instance, in the South China Sea, to all those tensions between China and the coastal countries that China is claiming, sovereignty over some of their maritime domains. So as to, again, going back to Anna's questions, maybe these agreements over fisheries and vaccines, some of the agreements have to do with facilitating the production of vaccines in the industrializing world. They at least suggest that some people were too quick in dismissing the ability of the Director General, because she's been very positive since her inception to the job, that we shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater, and that some things were feasible, and perhaps in the future more so. So Anna, I don't know if that completely answers the question.
I think that we have to understand that it does, and I thank you. We all thank you so much for your time, for your generosity. You addressed very important, very topical, very profound issues that certainly will shape short, medium, and long-term economic and political relations. And when I say political, I mean basically peace and conflict relations. So I think that we all share, everybody shares here with me. A big thank you for your really fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you again for very interesting questions.
Muchísimas gracias, Ethel. Un gusto verte y esperemos verte en vivo y en directo pronto, en algún hemisferio.
Que se diviertan.
So we only have 2 more things, and then the conference is finished. Marcelo Camusa from the University, from the Catholic University, will share with us a few words, and then Arie Kacowicz will end the conference.
Okay, we changed the order, so just, yeah, I mean, very quickly, it will take 2 minutes, and to reflect 3 days around the world, international around the world, what I learned from this conference, seriously. I learned Portuguese kidnapped translators in Africa to communicate in medieval times. I learned that there are different ways to interpret the German imperialism in the late 19th century. I knew, but I learned more, that Latin America is an international society, not in good health nowadays, but different from regional integration. We should know, it's not a good statistics, Latin America is the most violent region of the world. I learned that there are 23,000 students at the Universidad Católica here. I learned that the role of China in the war is a big interrogation mark. The contribution of Latin America to the discipline and practice of international relations should be emphasized. It's the relevance of Latin American feminism and the Latin American sociological thought. We should ask how to think about Latin America insertion in the world. There's an interesting activism in Latin America that has to be translated into situational knowledge. I'm quoting Diana Tusi, translating. The impact of domestic politics makes sense of Latin American foreign policy. We have to address change and continuity. One of our colleagues said the right-wing parties, this is a political comment, but I learned that too. The right-wing parties in Argentina, they don't want this current government to complete the mandate. I learned interrogation by impact of intellectuals upon the practice of international relations. Crises give us opportunities. Ukraine opened the possibility for energy efficient programs. There are implications of the Ukrainian crisis in humanitarian terms. There is violence going on against journalists in Brazil. There is a variation in the relationship between drugs and violence. There is a complicated relation between religion and violence in general, Latin America in particular. I learned that global supply changes have effects upon war and peace, and that the WTO has difficulties in fulfilling its role. So just very quickly, that's what we can learn, and I guess many of us learned, and we had intellectual fun. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Estamos en el cierre de este 6º Congreso del WISC y quiero decir algunas palabras de agradecimiento, básicamente, a el conjunto de gente, académicos, técnicos, que ha permitido que este Congreso se hiciera con bastante solvencia y orden. Hace varios años que venimos con esto, porque los fantasmas del apocalipsis, por lo menos el de la peste y de la guerra, estaban asolando la concreción del evento. Pero felizmente WISC tuvo paciencia y conseguimos concretarlo en nuestra universidad. Por eso estamos muy felices de clausurar este evento, porque ha sido un evento que ha permitido la participación de muchísimos intelectuales y académicos vinculados a las relaciones internacionales, tanto de forma presencial como de forma virtual, que, como dijo Arie, ampliaron, digamos, con sus debates una cantidad enorme de temas que hacen al objeto de las relaciones internacionales y que seguramente el aporte que se desarrolló ha corrido la frontera de esta ciencia en este congreso. Así que nos enorgullece ser sede de semejante actividad académica. Creemos en la evaluación que hacemos como locales, que las las cosas funcionaron bien, que ha sido un buen congreso y que todo buen congreso, como dije antes, es gracias al trabajo de mucha gente, ¿no? De gente visible y gente invisible que está atrás de las bambalinas, y por eso me tomo 2 minutos para agradecerle a todos este apoyo importante. Primero, muchas gracias a los participantes. Normalmente cuando un congreso termina, yo tengo mucha experiencia, o tenía mucha experiencia en organizar congresos, cuando un congreso termina están todos cansados, muchos, como es un congreso internacional, ya emprendieron su camino a su casa y el resto, el que queda, son realmente los de fierro, como decimos en la Argentina, que se bancan hasta el final. Muchas gracias a todos los participantes, los que están ahora y los que se fueron. Esperamos que hayan disfrutado del Congreso y de la hospitalidad porteña y de la hospitalidad de la UCA, y que se vayan a sus países con un buen recuerdo que los haga retornar pronto a la Argentina. Muchas gracias a WISC, en las personas de su presidente, la doctora Pinar Virgin, de Roberto Domínguez, de Arie Kacowicz, de Isaac Flores Delgado, que son miembros del board de dirección. A los representantes locales, Andrea Oelsner de la Universidad de San Andrés, a Melissa de Ciancio de Flaxo, y a nuestro profesor Ariel González por su apoyo en la organización de este evento. Sobre todo, a quien más hemos visto por la cercanía es Ariel, que se puso al hombro el Congreso, con el apoyo irrestricto de los miembros de la comisión local organizadora, con Diego Ferreira, María Laura Pereira Tarico, Catalina Gardey, el grupo del Centro de Estudios Internacionales, Patricio de la Giovana, Paloma Muñoz, Pilar Montero Martínez Otero, Camila Baelio y Sofía Meijide, entre otros que quizás me los olvido y pido disculpas. Todos del Departamento de Relaciones Internacionales que dirijo, por lo cual me siento muy orgulloso. Al rector de la universidad, el doctor Ángeles Schiavone, y a la decana de las Facultades Sociales, Liliana Pantano, y al secretario académico de la facultad, también le agradezco haber valorado la importancia que tenía este evento en nuestra universidad y permitido la utilización de las instalaciones y de otros muchos recursos para la realización del evento. A todos y cada uno de los miembros también del Laboratorio de Medios de la facultad, por todo el apoyo en la actividad de sonido y de imagen. Ha sido un congreso que mayoritariamente fue híbrido, con lo cual todo este trabajo también debe resaltarse. También nuestro agradecimiento a los voluntarios, a los estudiantes de Relaciones Internacionales, que con su participación amable, posibilitaron que este 6º Congreso fuese posible, atendiendo a todos los participantes con amabilidad y dedicación, y fueron muy eficientes en resolver algunos de los problemas que se fueron planteando, como siempre. Quiero agradecer finalmente a la gente de infraestructura y seguridad de la universidad, también por su apoyo, y al centro, al CAU, al Centro de Informática, también por estar atentos a todos los problemas que pudiéramos tener. Bueno, con esto termino los agradecimientos. Reitero, nosotros nos sentimos muy orgullosos de haber sido sede del 6º Congreso. Este 6º Congreso, sin lugar a dudas, impactará en nuestras carreras de ciencias políticas y relaciones internacionales, tanto de grado como de posgrado. Veo que impacta también un congreso académico de este nivel y de esta envergadura en los estudiantes. Ellos de este congreso sacan una lección importante de lo que vale la actividad intelectual en el mundo de las relaciones internacionales. Así que muchas gracias de nuevo a todos y bueno, esperamos en algún momento en el cual seguramente yo no estaré más, ser sede de algún otro congreso de la WISC. Nada más.
Muchas gracias.
¿Ya está listo? ¿Terminamos?
Ahora nos sentimos vacíos.
Ah, sí.